Today we have the pleasure of having with us Şenol Arslantaş, Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Istanbul University. I believe that Şenol has been following our work at the laboratory here, despite the linguistic barrier I'm about. And I wish to thank him personally for that. Now, as can be gleaned by the title of his presentation, his topic, quite appropriately, is an effort to debunk modern Turkish politics with a special focus, again quite appropriately, on the ascendance of the AKP, Erdogan's party, to power. To do that, Şenol is using the notion of populism, of which I've been quite critical, of course, lately. And I know that he is aware of some of the misgivings I have with populism, but I believe he does it in a way that is quite aware of the problematic areas. So we look forward to hearing his take on the subject. In this short introduction I have in mind, however, I want to highlight the theoretical, perhaps even the epistemological importance of his general approach, this effort to map the dynamics of contemporary political environments in a comprehensive, all-encompassing way. As I said in the advertisement to the presentation, whenever we take upon us such a task, it behooves us to construct and operate on the basis of a suitable ladder of theoretical abstraction, as I see it, one that allows us to move from the general or abstract to the concrete and vice versa. In order to be able to decipher the dynamics of social and political systems, indeed social and political phenomena in general, we need a sense both of the forest, as we say, as the saying goes, and of the individual tree. And of course, the question here is how general must this general be? Will it be global capitalism? Will it be global capitalism in crisis? Or will simply Turkish capitalism or plain Turkish politics without any socioeconomic aspect be sufficient? Equally crucial, however, is the temporal aspect. And by that I mean that we need to be able to establish the historical starting points of the path dependence leading to the outcomes we study, as well as the critical junctures, the turning points of the story. What were these in the case of the AKP? Was the outcome of its ascendance, of its coming to dominate Turkish politics, inevitable? And if it wasn't inevitable, which factors played the key role? Which factors functioned precisely as critical junctures? All these, of course, are very interesting questions, theoretically, but also empirically. And I've tried to touch upon the theoretical dimension, but I feel that one must also stress the empirical aspect. In Greece, but also internationally, we regularly talk about Turkey. We have the opportunity to discuss both Turkey and Erdogan. But the data we use is often poor, and even more often, it is used in a manner that is not theoretically conscious. And this leads me back to where I started, to why we're so pleased to having a young Turkish political scientist to kick off the discussion. A discussion, I must say, that we ought, as a laboratory, to try to keep up and continue. And I also want to mention something which to the younger people may not be as well known, is that Turkey has always, since the high days of the modernization school and whatever else followed it, including the best versions of the dependency theory, Turkey has always been an extremely interesting country amongst comparativists, both in its own sake and as a theoretically crucial case study. Once again, thank you, Shino, for sharing your paper with us. And let me pass on the virtual floor to you now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, really, for this kind introduction. I would like to talk about populism in Turkish case. So I think I hope this really gives some, at least like we can think more deeply to this notion as a result. For me, like when I was thinking about populism, I don't know why, but of course there are some reasons why I would start with 1970s, because especially in the beginning of 1970s, we know that social democratic consensus or the golden age of capitalism came to an end after the decline in capital profits and the rise in oil prices. So we know that this new period starting in the 1970s was marked by low growth rates, unemployment, and a wave of inflation. So there were a lot of social problems as a result, and we know that these social problems brought different political alternatives to the agenda. That's why I can call this period as like turbulent times or turbulent period where ruling classes also start to suffer. So we know that the political ruling class tended to build the neoliberal consensus against social democratic consensus. In general, neoliberalism is based on the rationalization of state intervention and sanctifying of the market order. Even the areas of social reproduction were left at the mercy of the market. In contrast, state's role was confined to a very limited area of activities such as childcare, healthcare, or education. So this new social order was supported by the capital class, but also by low layers of the middle class in general, and even working class, where some orientations such as individualism and the search for status become very obvious. So consumerism, technology, new habits, that all made neoliberalism penetration into people's life very easy, and it turned into a lifestyle as a result. So we can say that universities, think tanks, media, financial institutions, management boards, treasury departments, or central banks, or the institutions that regulate global finance and trade, they all contributed to the construction of this process. On the one hand, we know that neoliberalism has strengthened the financialization, indeed, instead of strengthening the market economy. So this was a contradiction in terms of our political economic settings. And also, we know that the spread of financialization to social reproduction spheres increased the fragility of the economies. So, and on the other hand, we also know that political elites came under the influence of new ruling bloc of financialization. Thus, it became very, very difficult to sustain democratic or public control over decisions. So we know that as a result, governments attack labor rights, wages, the weakness of the unions, of course, due to high unemployment and weak growth, led to the adoption of, for example, wage softening policy, etc. So, plus flexible and insecure employment has become widespread. Wealth and income inequalities also have increased, and welfare state was almost removed from the agenda. I think this was the period, or this was the moment where social problem in Europe materialized, and social crisis of neoliberalism became more apparent. So I think this was accompanied by another crisis. To make it more concrete, I can talk about a little bit of political institutional settings of the 1970s and the 1980s. I think for example, ordinary citizens were excluded from decision making. Depoliticization, technocratization became more widespread. Political institutions started to lose their legitimacy. And I think the critical thing is this: critical decisions were taken unilaterally by a handful of financial and political elites. So these ideologically motivated limitations, along with the depoliticized character of neoliberal democracy, have largely ruined democratic or public control over decisions. But not only social democratic and socialist parties, but also communist parties failed to cope with and overcome neoliberal constellation, which manifested itself in competing political discourses and actors, as well as rising social mobilization and social protest dynamics. I think populism and populist parties could be counted only in this background. So, because crises are still, by the way, waiting to be solved, that's why populism is playing a very significant role in postponing the real alternatives to solutions. So that's why I call this period as an interregnum, where several morbid symptoms, including populism, have appeared. We can say that mainstream institutions are really suffering a lot. They are about to die, but new cannot be born. And here, for me, populism denotes a way of stealing, but not representing the will of the people and sovereignty of the people, mostly based on a rule of charismatic authority. But I would like to make it more concrete when I discuss Turkish case now. So in general, unlike culturalist or political institutional arguments with regard to populism, I would like to mention more on the side of structural political economic conditions and social mobilization and protests that led to the rise of populism for me in Turkey. So when we look at the Turkish case in terms of political structural and political economic conditions, we can say that Turkey became integrated into a neoliberal international economic system following a coup d'etat, indeed. So 1980 military coup provided this process, as a result of which, indeed, opponents of neoliberal turn, including leftist circles and their well-grounded labor organizations, were liquidated. I think it is only possible to catch up Turkish transformation or Turkish adoption of neoliberalism only under these conditions. Under the shadow of a military dictatorship, the transition to democratic regime was also very conditional. So the elimination of communist left made an electoral victory possible for a neoliberal Motherland Party or Turgut Özal's Anavatan Partisi in 1983 elections. So we know that many things have changed in this period. Özal's period continued for 8 years. National economy became much more export-oriented and open up to foreign markets. And the government also prioritized several critical decisions, including privatization of public assets, deregulation of financial markets, and liberalization of trade. So this materialized indeed what Turgut Özal, the leader of the party, was strongly believing: there is no alternative to capitalism, or neoliberal orthodoxy necessitating neoliberal restructuring of traditional social and economic configurations. But we know that there were so many problems, especially in the starting in the beginning of 1980s, continued up until 2002. Like export-led growth strategy led to high current account deficits. National debt augmented in this period because of a tax collection problem similar to the Greek case, I believe. And another issue was the lack of regulation, control, and transparency in banking sector. High inflation, unemployment, they all persisted over the decades. So, and also the feeble industrial infrastructure and shrinking agricultural sector raise even more concerns about the health of the economy. So, and in addition, corruption was another problem. Accountable institutions were not existent there at the time. So still it is the case indeed. So I can say that despite the existence of severe structural and institutional problems embedded in uncontrolled neoliberalism of the country, national governments didn't target them, mainly because of high political cost associated with the solution process. So the result was so simple indeed. There were so many economic crises in the 1980s and 1990s. But in comparison, we can say that the crisis exploded in the 1980s and 1990s were not economically, socially, politically devastating as the February 2001 crisis, triggered by a very simple event indeed, by the tension between prime minister and the president over the supervision of a state-owned bank. And an original political constitutional crisis indeed rapidly turned into a full-fledged economic and financial crisis, ultimately introducing radical and transformative changes towards economic, social, and political settings. The austerity, because the government just said, okay, the situation is very bad, so we should knock the door of World Bank and IMF. So, and in return, of course, there was a conditionality for the support of financial and economic support. So, and conditionality means indeed the austerity. So this meant innocent citizens would pay for the crisis. So this, I think, put a very naive strategy that requires strong redistribution, favoring upper classes vis-a-vis lower middle classes. So, and unlike this, for example, the profits of the private sector would not be socialized at the time. So there were so many other things that was on the agenda. Insecurities in labor markets, such as layoffs, were expanded, wages, pensions were dramatically declined, millions of citizens, especially women and young people, lost their job. Poverty not only surged, but also became a part of everyday life indeed. So draconian cuts in social public expenditure was also on the agenda, and it manifested itself in the decline of health and education expenses. The result was the rising suicide levels. So I think there was this, so I can say that there was a big social crisis at the time. I think this is pretty similar to the Greek case in the beginning of the age of austerity. So the similar processes and the political results were similar as well. Because Turkish electorates, like Greek electorates, they punish all coalition members, albeit in different degrees, but we know that especially DSP, Democratic Left Party, was mainly held responsible for the crisis, and it was almost on the verge of a political extinction as a result, like PASOK, indeed. Yeah. So the parties in office during the times of crisis, they were really very unlucky, and then like electors punish the parties who voted for the austerity as its crisis strategy. So I can say that against this background, the radically changing, as you see, domestic context turned into a political opportunity structure for the parties in opposition. Context definitely matters, and the erosion of public trust in ruling parties was mainly responsible for a radical political change in the country. The winner of the de-alignment and then the realignment of Turkish voters became newly founded but historically well-grounded, indeed, AKP, Justice and Development Party, which sprouted from the seeds of a strong conservative Islamist political tradition known as the National View in the 1960s. But like unlike this, because no one was thinking at the time like this party is a continuation of something else, but instead AKP's advantage became this. It was established just before the outbreak of the crisis, in August 2001, so a couple of months before the crisis. Therefore, it was not perceived as part of a corrupt political establishment. I think the party was openly hailed as an outsider. You can see the newspapers, for example, they all depicted AKP as an outsider, which had nothing to do with dirty politics, and hence took advantage of the collapse of mainstream politics in Turkey. I think here I should little bit talk about, because I think for me populism is very much associated with a charismatic authority. So here we should little bit talk about Erdogan's position here. So let me find some of my notes here, because I took some notes to read here. So we can say that, of course, a quick glance would be enough to often suggest that Erdogan's personal account with secular Republican order had a conflict-ridden nature. For example, he was banned from politics for 5 years by the Constitutional Court after the closure of Islamist Welfare Party in January 1998. And in the meantime, he was put into jail in 1999 due to a religious speech he had made during his presidency of Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality. So I think for this reason, the places, especially in neighborhoods where religious sensitivity is so high, for example, look at the periphery of Istanbul and Ankara, the places where I lived, to be honest. So Erdogan was considered, if you talk to any guys, they would possibly say Erdogan is a victim of elegantly corrupt, elitist and secular Republican order. So the marginalized conservative groups, they predominantly hailed Erdogan as one of them. And also they claim that he targeted dirty politics fueled by secular political and economic elites in the country. So this is, I think, very, very significant for like his rise to power. Of course, another issue, like we should talk, I think, theoretically, we can say that people at the time, because the situation was really very bad, they were calling for a savior who manifested itself in Erdogan's charismatic authority. This term, coined by Weber, I think better explains Erdogan's indisputable weight on Turkish politics and society for several reasons. So to analyze it, I think we should look at the main characteristics of charismatic authority. The first one is, for example, this. The original settings in which a charismatic authority emerged are predominantly unusual. The moments of social breakdown, economic downturn, or political instability best exemplify this. Rather unusual, I think, combination of these three criteria in the context of 2001 crisis could be counted. The second aspect is that under worsening economic, social and political conditions, masses began to ascribe a number of extraordinary and exceptional characteristics to a particular leader for their salvation. Likewise, Erdogan was hailed as a heroic figure, depicted as fearless, humble, perfect, non-corrupt, moral or challenging figure. And above all, I think this gives him a right to talk and act on behalf of the people. Yeah, and in this designation, I think what is pretty apparent is this populist communication strategies assume a critical role. For instance, he all the time tries to establish a more authentic and sincere relationship with the people. And to do this, all the time his humble socioeconomic background was emphasized, despite he's like a very rich guy at the moment, and we don't know really like how rich he is. So, but still, especially his party, they are trying to underline the working class roots of his family and his residence in the poor district of Istanbul, Kasımpaşa. They were generally stressed. Since he was perceived as one of them, he can also directly address voters, even mostly by passing his party organizations. I think this is resembling populist mobilization termed by Peter Mayer. So I think meanwhile, there is also one striking aspect of his success. It is this: he all the time emphasizes his victimhood to strengthen the perception that they always pay the price for defending the people. And the emphasis on his prison days, especially in Pınarhisar prison, best illustrates this tendency. Since charismatic authority is defined out of dirty politics, there is usually a blind and bigoted loyalty to a charismatic leader, who is then promoted to the status of a legendary personality. So I think at the same time, a charismatic authority also eliminates any doubt or inquiry about social, economic, political ills, since he knows all solutions better than anyone else in this planet, indeed. So in this framework, the solution of almost all issues of the state, society, have been delegated to a single man, who frequently proposed. You can see from his speeches very clearly, he always proposes immediate, authoritarian, predominantly irrational recipes for complex issues. So he's in charge of everything. Therefore, without his consent and approval, almost nothing works out in the country. Yeah. So, but we know that, of course, after some time, a charismatic authority can fail. Yeah, the solutions offered by a charismatic authority can fail, and then you should find something to fill this gap, right? So the invention of usable scapegoats for failures, or putting the blame on a traditional political institutional configuration of a country, I think would be helpful in this regard. And I would like to talk about in this issue, because we know that he's finding like some usable scapegoats is really, he's quite talented in this. And he's generally putting the blame on some parts of some segments of the people who can be easily marginalized from the political power. These groups include Alevis, Kurds, the parties in the opposition, from Republican People's Party to Good Party, like from left to right, Communist parties, socialist parties, conservative, even Islamic or conservative parties, which are following the same national or let's say the same tradition with AKP. So they are all demonized. We can see this, and all the time when things are going bad, the AKP and the party leader Erdogan are putting all the blame on this different components of the domestic opposition. And many times he's also, I think, like until a couple of years, he was all the time putting the blame on like the labor movement, but nowadays, because labor movement is so weak, he's not talking about this issue anymore. So as I said, because he's trying to, demonize domestic opposition, but he's also sometimes like finding external enemies, such as United States, Greece, Israel, Syria, European Union, different countries within the EU, etc. To like say, for example, like things are going bad because of these guys. Yeah, and that's why he's many times trying to he's trying to taking advantage of the foreign policy issues to manipulate people to his beliefs. So the demonization of the domestic opposition, as well as the system that was associated with this demonization, all Turkey was substituted by the glorification of the new order formulated under the notion of New Turkey. Above all, we know that Erdogan considered a corrupt bureaucracy associated with the elitist origins of the secular republic as the core of all sins. So, but still, depending on the context, various components of the state apparatus, such as a military, constitutional court, Supreme Electoral Council, Council of the State, Supreme Court, etc., and etc., these institutions were deliberately targeted. And in line with the essence of a charismatic authority, but Erdogan heavily employed in his fight against the establishment was not a meritocracy, but the total elimination of it in the selection of state officers, paving the way for a partisan state. So, of course, we know that historically speaking, one of the common features of the ruling parties in Turkey and Greece is that they frequently promote their supporters to key positions in state bureaucracy. And due to widespread clientelism and party patronage, it become, especially nowadays, very difficult to find a bureaucratic position in Turkey, especially after the eruption of the failed coup attempt in late 2016. This is the case. So then I can say that an arbitrary, corrupt, and politicized state apparatus became institutionalized in Turkey. This also, I think, explains why Erdogan's populist attacks against state bureaucracy diminish in recent years. Furthermore, in the case of charismatic authority, we know that abstract procedures and rules are substituted by the leader's dedication to the cause, the leader's ability on sparking social mobilization and shifting the mood of the people with a strong political discourse, I think could be counted here. So, for instance, Erdogan frequently attempted to mobilize the society out of a politicization of a traditional social cleavage based on a conservative secular distinction and of worsening diplomatic relationship with the United States, Germany, Syria, France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc., and etc. So, as you see, he, on the one side, plays to politicize this secular conservative distinction, which is quite strong and is dominating public discourse to a large extent. So, on the other side, when he cannot do this because of some reasons, he's trying to deal with other side and try to politicize worsening diplomatic relations with other countries. So this is, I think, his strategy that he employed successfully for a certain period of time. So from time to time, to ease public pressure, for example, over the government with regard to unsolved domestic issues such as unemployment, inequalities, inflation, poverty, the government strategically diverted citizens' attention to a foreign policy realm through inventing usable enemies. So, despite the fact that charismatic authority aims to maintain its power through invented enemies and triggering social mobilization against these enemies, failed promises might put Black's political stability into a danger. In other words, since citizens' expectations are higher for a leader's ability to cope with and overcome critical issues for a certain victory, unsolved problems may turn into the main weakness of a charismatic authority. So the erosion of, on the other hand, charismatic authority implies the routinization of the charismatic authority. In Turkey, the collapse of economic miracle, rise of social dissatisfaction, the loss of trust in public political parties and democracy, the failed. These are the things that I think forcing Erdogan's ruling very much. So the erosion of his authority manifests itself then in the form of competing political discourses and actors. That is the end of a hegemonic ruling of the incumbent party. So the rise of fractionalism within the AKP ranks in recent years, for example, led to the emergence of two political parties, Deva Partisi and Gelecek Partisi. So, like these parties are challenging AKP very well, and also there are some other political parties that challenge the AKP. So I can say that out of this, of course, like I'm talking about generally the political institutional conditions, because these are very significant to understand, I think, Turkish politics. But also I would like to talk about a little bit social mobilization and social protest dynamics to understand why populism is on the rise in the country. So I can say that for almost 10 years, the Turkish economy is going really very bad. So there were several dollar shocks. Inflation is rising. Interest rates are rising, despite central banks' intervention. Yeah, because we know that, for example, today there is no money in the Central Bank of Turkey, so they cannot properly even intervene in the market. Yeah. So I think the result was this: on the one side, rising authoritarianism, and on the other side, economic difficulties led to the emergence of new social challenges. And we should then look at, because AKP's, I think, for me, neoliberal and authoritarian agenda politicize and mobilize millions of citizens, especially during the Gezi Park protest of 2013. I think at some point we can resemble it to syntagma movement in Greece, because, like, I think it may be compared with massive protests erupted in a number of European countries, such as Spain, Greece, or France, in the age of austerity. I think the reason why we have seen the rise of political social mobilization and social protest dynamics is this: because political alternatives to AKP suffered electorally. Yeah, and elections, therefore, they lost their meanings for many desperate citizens of Turkey. So the result is the surface of new social alternatives. I think the Gezi Park protest, it openly demonstrated that AKP's ruling strategy angered millions of citizens. In fact, quite compatible, for example, with destructive neoliberal developmentalist agenda. The main trigger for the sudden social action was the demolition of the trees in Taksim's Gezi Park for building a new shopping mall in the heart of Istanbul. So the event surprisingly promoted spontaneous massive protest in late May 2013, and it extended all over the country. According to data revealed by Turkish police, millions of citizens participated in protests in almost all cities. Thousands were detained and hundreds were arrested as a result. So in fact, before the explosion of Gezi Park incident, there was a scholarly consensus on that that protest culture remained weak in Turkey for several decades. Of course, the legacy of 1980 coup is one of the dimension here. But in contrast to this historical tendencies, Gezi united considerable number of people from different political, social, ideological, cultural backgrounds. So even these guys are supporting different football teams, So but they came together in streets. Therefore, heterogeneity was the norm in this sense. And I think one of the things that is very clear for Gezi is this: protesters that define themselves by what they oppose rather than what they propose. So we know that, of course, being against something or someone doesn't necessarily implies that there would be an alternative instead. Yeah. So the construction of an alternative to anything is a totally different process. But we know that, and this is, I think, very well documented in the literature. It is the Islamization of social and political sphere, rising authoritarianism, intensified political and social polarization, intolerance towards alternative lifestyles and beliefs, the feeblement of the labor movement, marginalization of particular religious sects or ethnicities from decisions, gender discrimination, the imposition of conservative lifestyle on women, removal of mainstream media. That's why people were all joking about the situation of the position of mainstream media in Turkey, which was totally removed in recent years, and they all came to under the influence of AKP. So on the other side, precarization of the youth, similar to, I think, 700 euro generation in Greece. Yeah. So young people, they are, even if they graduate from the best universities, that doesn't mean that they will find a very good job. Yeah, if they find any job. So mounting, I think, unemployment and poverty level, as well as rising anti-environmentalist neoliberal developmentalism of the party United People there. So, but here we can also say that just as anti-austerity protests in Greece and Spain, Gezi protests could not be attributed to a particular political actor. A protest action took place in a spontaneous manner without any leader or a political program. And it didn't bring about the emergence of a new political alternative, unlike, for example, Syriza and Podemos in Greece and Spain. Yeah. So various social, political, and cultural heterogeneity engaged in this process encourage more people to participate in actions. It also made it weaker in terms of determining a fundamental aim to reach, especially after brutal police intervention took place in subsequent weeks. So I can say that, but the result was this: because it was brutally suppressed, people's demand still stay there to be, represented. This was, I think, one of the reasons why people then thought, okay, we should do something at the level of political parties to combine our forces against a kind of an enemy. Yeah. So I think the construction of the political realm, as a war zone between Erdoganists and anti-Erdoganists, I think was a result of this process. So I think one thing which is corresponding to opposition coordination is this: different components of political opposition began to soften their discourses against each other because they met in the streets. Yeah, they realized that these guys do not think quite differently about Erdogan and AKP. Of course, they have some different views, but then they realize, okay, we should just soften our discourses and target the common enemy here. So, strategic voting was employed by both Republican People's Party, the biggest opposition party in Turkey. It's a secular nationalist political party, sometimes becoming social democratic, but never become really very leftist. And HDP, the Kurdish party, People's Democratic Party, I think, which will be closed down by Constitutional Court in following weeks, because Erdogan just said, after especially HDP, Kurdish guys, they started to support Republican People's candidate in March 2019 elections. Erdogan said, I think that's enough, and we should do something to get rid of this party. That's why there is a party closure. This is a very, really anti-democratic thing, but still it is going on in the country. And the party leader, who was very popular among youth people, Selahattin Demirtas, was also put into jail. So this was the revenge of AKP to show that they are ruling the country. And here they mean, because for me, one of the fundamental characteristics of populism is, of course, the people. And the people, this concept is also a construction. So here the people is constructed to conceal, I think this discourse is, or this term is used to conceal the exact, I think, intention of the ruling party, which is this. Normally, this concept is literally corresponding to a particular social group, which is, I think, conservative majority. So this is, I think, AKP is taking this dimension into its mind, because when you voice to a large number of voters, then, because right-wing parties are always winning elections in Turkey, this would be a very rational choice for AKP to pursue. That's why AKP is always formulating the people as the conservative majority. And this is a kind of I think in this regard, populism can be taught as extreme majoritarianism, because if conservative majority is saying something, this is the truth, opposition parties, opposition groups, all people should just obey the result according to this logic. So this is the thing that I can say. But in recent years, because I think it is not, it was a couple of years ago, since especially the failed coup attempt in 2016, AKP said, okay, that's enough, because I think their energy to accuse all the time opposition groups failed at the time, because economic issues, social issues, the issues regarding democracy, human rights, social rights, they were all there awaiting to be solved, and the government do not do anything to absorb these different demands into political system. So they failed, and they said, okay, we should do something, reinstitutionalize. This is this reinstitutionalization of the nation. So that's why they went to a referendum. First, the president of Turkey was then will be elected by the people through direct vote. So Erdogan then can represent all people easily in this way. And the second thing is this, because Erdogan's personality is so supreme over everything, that even his party apparatus is, I think, not important anymore. That's why he also tried to reorganize his party as well as the nation. New bureaucratic institutions, which were totally dependent on Erdogan, were institutionalized, and these institutions also failed, because now I think this is the time where the limits of and the contradictions of, indeed, his populist rhetoric became so obvious. On the one side, he says, okay, I'm super hyper you know, how can I say, he's revolting everything. Yeah. So that's why he's saying, okay, I'm revolting to the political establishment. The powers that were fired by the people are still in the power indeed. So we will be getting rid of all these. So this is the one thing. And then he said, okay, to compensate this, we should need a new arrangement, political institutional arrangement, so that we can convince the citizens that they are in the power. So I think this was the thing that he was nowadays doing, but still, because what he promised is not on the ground, he failed, and that's why I think, like other populist parties, he used like the attraction of populist discourse, but then the realities, I think, are there, and his populist rhetoric is about to die. I think that's why I believe, like, within 2 years or 3 years, he will not be in power anymore. So I think for me, this is the general background for analyzing his discourse. I called here populism as stealing of power of the people, because what he promised, like, it failed and faded away soon. And then he was also talking within the ranks of, indeed, political establishment, because his previous party was the part of this political establishment. So he was also as dirty as the other guys, yeah, other political parties. Or so I think when we think of this, we can say that the contradiction of his populist attitudes are also will be the end of, or digger of, his thing. Yeah, so yeah, this is the thing that I would like to say. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Shino, for this very interesting paper. I will do a commentary now. As I say, I find the paper very interesting, both in terms of its breadth and in terms of its theoretical boldness and general scope. And I want to thank you, Şenol, for sharing it with us. And let me also add that I'm no Turkish specialist, so I'm mostly learning from the paper, and of course I'm eager to learn more. As I said in my brief introduction, I think that the paper belongs to a variety of research of which we definitely need more. This comprehensive purview, which is underlined by a specific theoretical thread, I think is a prerequisite for raising and researching more specific questions. And I want to also add that Şenol sent me a paper, an early version of the paper, which includes some of the stuff that was not mentioned in this presentation. Once the presentation, does the opposite. So I'll be combining my comments. Maybe some of them will become more, appropriate for the written version of the paper. I was intrigued by your use of the concept of populism, because it does play a key role in the presentation. And on the other hand, it's not quite necessary for populism, in my view, to play such a big role. First of all, I must underline that I concur with your definition of populism, As you put it in the paper, and you mentioned it in the title of the actual work, that it denotes a way of stealing, but not representing the will and sovereignty of the people, which concurs with my view of populism, which is deceptive invocations of the popular. It's pretty much the same thing. But I don't think that your use of it is quite consistent throughout, or I'm not clear as of the ways you're using the concept. So sometimes I'm not fully comfortable with the way the notion is used, because often I sense that it does not really assist you with your analytical goals. Maybe it even burdens your analytical goals, your effort to sort of tell us a story. The AKP, you dub it, of course, populist, but the reasons for doing that appear to be a bit ad hoc, in my view. And let me explain why. It's because Erdogan appeals to various sections of the population, which again is pretty much what every other politician does. Of course, he does it in a specific way, but so they do other politicians as well. And the real point I want to make here is that what appears to be distinctive about the populist, evocations, in his case, is not really, or in any case, is not theoretically distinct. It is just doing traditional right-wing politics a la turca, in a Turkish way. In post-war Greece, for example, as we were saying earlier, we had a similar experience. You might know about this with the triangle, the king, the military, and the quasi-authoritarian right wing. If one researches their discourse, he is likely to find similarities. Of course, to the extent, as you pointed out, that we detect the systematic abuse of minority rights, I think it is more appropriate to start speaking of quasi or outright authoritarianism, albeit with a mass following. In other words, I don't see why we should conceptualize this behavior as springing from the construction of a collective identity, or to put it in Laclauian terms, the chains of equivalence. And come to think of it, this is a very old discursive modality, as you described it in your oral presentation. It's even the content of the melodramatic genre in literature, like the poor, the honest, the always victimized, who, comes to, prominence through honesty and hard work. These are old modalities. There's nothing special about them. And if we give up calling the regime authoritarian and start calling it populist, attention shifts away from, the other stuff you bring up with your analysis. So, in my view, I think what is really interesting in what you said concerns the roots, and you touched upon them, of course, but theorization upon the roots of AKP emergence and this apparent resilience it has. For example, that how is it that it has managed to represent the disenfranchised, the marginalized strata? And you did mention the situation before Erdogan's emergence, but I think this is the area we should be focusing. You do that in the paper, but sort of give the answer of populism begs the question. And I say that precisely because all the ingredients of the answer and the prerequisites for undertaking this detailed analysis are in the paper and in your presentation, and you're making a very convincing case at that. You're speaking about the aspects of the neoliberal consensus, corruption, the impasses of the political system, and so on and so forth. And in your analysis, the only area with which I'm not comfortable is something you mentioned in the paper, in the presentation you just touched upon. You sort of tend to give a quasi-essentialist view of the conservative majority. You say in the paper, for example, and I've taken special note of it, say this dichotomy relies on a logical calculation since conservatives consist of the majority of the Turkish population. There's an essentialist ring to it, because we do that in the seminar very often. We argue that social movements, collective identities, as a result, voters are not conservative, liberal, or radical because of innate predispositions, much less because their political preference is ingrained in their genes. It is something relational. It develops, it evolves, it changes. It's not that once you have a social cleavage, it stays like that, especially in times of crisis. We've seen that in Greece, and in your concluding remarks, you sort of make us believe that we are starting to see it in Turkey as well. And if we adopt a historical perspective, we could have said that for the majority of the global population. For example, on the eve of the October Revolution, people were conservative, right, before that, but that changes. So it would seem to me that Erdogan's success, and this is what I have in mind when I say maybe employing the populist research agenda keeps us from raising the key questions, both for comparative politics and for contentious politics, is that it reflects the impasse, the dead end of two sorts of political interventions, one of which, of course, is a wholesale political project. And I'm referring to the utter failure of liberal modernization, or in the Turkish idiom, the Republican modernization. Like the fact that these guys sought to modernize Turkey, but that reached a dead end. And it started moving backwards, in other words, exacerbating all the problems you mentioned. The fact that Erdogan managed to turn against these elites and that worked out ought to make us look into more details into their performance. What was the nature of the Republican project? What were its limits? Why were the limits there? Is it a function of the world system? Is it because they were particularly corrupt as individuals? What are the mechanics? We need to be looking more attentively into this area of the story. I think that the populist research agenda prevents us from researching it as thoroughly as we must. For example, we learn about the reactionary character of Erdogan, who is a populist, who is this and that, whom I prefer to call a reactionary right-wing politician. But sometimes we fail to appreciate the nature of the Republican alternative, which sometimes turns out to be as reactionary, equally reactionary. Right? And this is the reason why somebody who claims that is an outsider can be so successful. And the second impasse has to do with your remarks about the shortcomings of the Gezi protest, which also reflect problems in the Turkish left, of course, this is a big discussion. We're not really up to bringing it up to date today. But I think that one must look very attentively into, deeds and omissions, strategies by the left during the Republican period, which prevented from having a capacity to resist the coup of the 80s, play a different role in the period that followed that, and present an alternative that, had they managed to do, they would keep from allowing Erdogan to do it. So it's not that simply Erdogan capitalized upon the failures of the Republican, project. It's also that the left was not able to do as much, in other words. And what you said about the Gezi protests is also very interesting. But I'm sure that there must have been political strands within the protest, maybe not institutionalized, maybe not readily visible, but sure there were people who would identify themselves as secular, simply secular, others as libertarian, others as extreme left. There were some projects which did not come to fruition. These omissions are also critical for us to start researching if we can. And of course, if so far I've touched upon, the character, the nature, and the roots of AKP's performance, it is equally important, as you do in the paper, in a very satisfactory manner, I might add, to look at its actual performance in government, which lends you your title. And I think, again, populism is an obstacle. It's a hurdle. It doesn't help the analysis to move forward. At one point, for example, you also mentioned it in the presentation, you claimed that the government had a neoliberal, anti-environmentalist agenda. So if we say that you have a populist who has a neoliberal and anti-environmentalist agenda, why not say that this guy is a right-wing authoritarian politician with a neoliberal agenda? Because what makes a populist is someone who appeals to the people against the elites. But that doesn't guide my research attention to what is really crucial. That's my... and if we, nowadays, especially so, because it's visible, agree that Erdogan is having a neoliberal authoritarian agenda, that would explain the performance of the government. It's not because of populism, it's because he needs to coerce and suppress, otherwise there's going to be a social response. Especially since you demonstrate that he has been consistently supporting another segment of the elites. You didn't mention that much in the presentation, but it's in the paper. And I found that very interesting in the paper. It's the section that I like the most. Even the extent to which Erdogan and the AKP may be the embodiment of a new bourgeois project. I think you argue as much in the paper. Something which people were very keen to study in Latin American politics. See the alignment and the rifts and the realignments within the domestic elites and, the internationalized sections of the bourgeoisie, and how they clashed with local sections of the bourgeoisie and so on. Nowadays, we don't do that much, and populism doesn't orient us into raising these questions. For example, it would be very interesting to find out more about the particulars of the Muziad, this Muslim, whatever is the meaning of of the acronym. And finally, about charisma, you're making a very, again, interesting argument. I follow, it's, whatchamacallit, it makes sense. One can't disagree what you say about charisma, but I'm interested in suggesting that populism, understood as what you say is deceptive invocations of the popular, does not require charisma. It may be essential or a typical feature of cases where predisposed to characterize as populist, but it's not a necessary feature. And I have in mind the analysis of Mayer, basically, you know, that strand of the literature, and Kenneth Roberts, and you know, this strand which detect populism essentially in the organizational upshot of this tendency to behave differently from what is pronounced, which requires the clashing, the destruction, the establishment, rather, of top-down structures, this organizational plebiscitarianism, which involves abolition of intermediary organs, which would be capable of, you know, exerting some control and, you know, preventing the leadership from acting at whim. Now, and Mayer has shown that the defining feature of populism, again understood as an organic outgrowth of the political underpinning and the discursive practice that goes with it, does not require the presence of charisma. As his case, as you know, is the Blairite Labour Party. Charisma may be a facilitating factor, but is not required. And I'm raising this to the extent that we continue the discussion about populism. Anyway, concluding now, I think that this is a very promising research agenda. Sometimes I'm not comfortable and I'm a bit apprehensive with the uses of populism as conventionally understood, because you blend a conventional understanding of populism and a critical understanding of populism. The stealing business is a critical understanding of populism. But once again, I wish to thank you, Shanol. I think that was a marvelous presentation, and I appreciate, as I said, the boldness, the theoretical boldness, like your take at the subject, which is all-rounded and comprehensive, and your perspicacity, like the fact that you have managed to process quite a large volume of data. And this is a very hot topic. I think it will stay with us for a long time. It has enormous theoretical significance, comparative significance. And Turkey once again proves this old tradition that the guy who is studying Turkey is bound to be a good comparativist, because he draws lots of theoretical conclusions about very critical social and political phenomena. So thank you and keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot, really,
Okay.
for your kind words.